Verbal communication. Verbal communication involves the use of language. Language is a collection of symbols that can be arranged in a particular order according to its particular grammar. So how is verbal communication symbolic? Well, verbal communication involves the use of language which is made up of symbols. And these symbols are arbitrary representations of something else. There is no direct connection between a symbol and what it represents. Symbols are used to represent objects. Symbols, in fact, are arbitrary. The meanings applied to words are ambiguous. There is often disagreement on the meanings applied to some words. Meanings applied to words, not the meanings of words, are important to understand. See, symbols have no inherent meaning. Symbols are given meaning along with value and power when used during interactions between two people or with many people. It is through the actual use of language that meanings, in fact, develop. It is through the use of language along with other symbolic activity that relationships and identities and cultures and realities are transacted. Now, verbal communication also involves, it does have meanings. Now, there are two kinds. They are denotative and connotative meanings. Now, the word polysemy, which is not something we use a lot, but it recognizes there are multiple meanings given to the same word. You find that just about everything. There are many things that have more than one meaning depending on who you're talking to. Now, denotative meaning is the general meaning that the word, that the word dictionary has the meaning of a word. In other words, how is a word defined? So denoting the same object with the same words is fundamental, in fact, in communication. You have to have a base. However, then there's the connotative meaning, and that refers to the overtones and implications associated with the word or object. Some words carry baggage that can elicit, an emotional response. Words carry strong and varying connotations in particular cultures and within particular relationships. For instance, if you were talking with a bunch of your friends and one of them looked at you after you made a comment and they said you're an idiot, you might say something back to them, somewhat derogatory, but you might respond to them, or you just might laugh and take it because it was your friend, and you understand that when he says you're an idiot, he's really not meaning anything personal about it. He's just making a comment, and it's usually done in humor. Now, not always, but most of the time. However, if I had graded one of your papers and I'm handing back papers in class and I hand you your paper back and I look at you and I say you're an idiot, well, the connotation would be quite different. Would you not agree? So connotations are those understandings that we have in communicating in certain situations, and a lot of times they're based on the situation, the relationships, all kinds of things like that. So that's where we get our double entendres, where we're saying one thing, meaning absolutely something else, things like that. We can do that. Anyway, it's not just that. Now, the truth is that the ability to understand somebody improves as we know more about the associations that he or she makes with certain words, either interculturally or personally. And as a result of those of their denotative and connotative meanings, it means words are generally given particular values in society, and the values have developed over time and are reinforced and socially constructed. Words change over time and what they mean. When your grandmother said she used to have a very gay friend, she certainly wasn't talking about his or her sexual orientation. However, in today's society, well, it's a little bit different, and you hardly ever hear anyone under the age of 60 referring to anybody else as being gay, unless what they're talking about is their sexual orientation. The same thing could be said with a lot of other words that are used in our, in our social interactions with one another. So just understand that that's part of this. You have denotative, which is how it's defined. Connotative is how we understand it, and that all depends a lot of times on relationships as well as situations. Now, there was a gentleman, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him a little later, but his name was Burke, and he made a distinction between God terms and devil terms. Now, God terms are powerful terms that are viewed positively in a society. Devil terms are viewed negatively in a society. Now, you may be able to come up with some of those when you think about it, but these terms, they're not absolute for everybody in the same society, and these terms also exist in relationships. There are certain things that you don't discuss, and there are topics that have a positive result, and they would fall under these God terms or devil terms, just depending on how we look at them and how you perceive them. It's an interesting concept that most people don't ever think about. But there are certain words we know you don't say in public or in certain social settings because they're not usually taken very well. Those would be devil terms. And then there's those others, many words that and understandings that are out there that would be understood as being positive or God terms. One of the things about verbal communication is that it is very relational. Matter of fact, verbal communication transacts relationships. Now, verbal communication and other symbolic activity, through those things, relationships are actually developed and they're maintained. And these and symbolic creations are talked into existence. Symbolic creations, what's that? Well, it talk about the future, something about tomorrow. Does it exist? No, but when you talk about someone and you tell them what you're going to be doing tomorrow, you're creating an understanding about something that does not yet exist. And that's how we and that's part of how we transact our relationships. Relationships also, they do things like they regulate our verbal communication. Relationships, they influence the meanings that are given to words and the words that are actually used. Saying or not saying something reinforces the existence of a particular relationship. So we may withhold negative comments to some of our close friends that someone else you might be willing to say to somebody else. And on the other hand, maybe there's something negative that you would say to somebody because they are your friend. Making a comment about their clothing that they're wearing, or something that's on their face, or something stuck in their teeth. You might mention that to someone that you know as opposed to a stranger. But specific relationships, in fact, are reinforced through the meanings and the intentions that we assign the words of others. Relationships are, when you talk to somebody and you tell them, if you tell someone that you love them, that reinforces those feelings. If you tell them that you care about them, that you worry about them, that you it bothers you when they're sad or whatever it might be, you are in fact building that relationship. Now, see, the truth of it is enemies don't trust each other to mean what they say, suspecting their words to be lies or misdirection. And certainly if you're not getting along with someone, we use sarcasm and things like that where it sounds like we're being positive, but the tone of voice tells us we're not. So relationships regulate how we talk to one another and in what situations, what meanings to apply to words in certain relationships. Now, the thing with relationships have what people understand as shared meanings. Now, learning to understand others' worlds of meaning is part of becoming closer to others. When you came to IPFW and you say, "Hey, I'll meet you at Kettler," we understand what Kettler means, but it's only because you're at IPFW. If you suddenly start collecting mastodons and putting them up in your room or something, that's because you're at IPFW. You certainly wouldn't do that if you were at IU. But at IPFW, that's just a part of the culture. So we learn to understand other worlds, the worlds of others and their meanings that they use in as we grow closer to them. And when we know people better, we also know better what they mean when they make certain comments. And that's not the case with strangers. Relationships are transacted in part because there's shared meanings and patterns of communication. When you get close to people and you have a close personal friend, or if you have a best friend, chances are you talk the same, or there are things that you know about and the stories that you share, memories that you have that mean nothing to other people, but to the two of you, it's much different. Now, No one else shares the exact same understandings, common history, experiences, or knowledge of the same people or assumptions that you take for granted in a particular relationship. For instance, just because, if you have a really what you would refer to as a best friend, and you have other friends, but they don't understand your best friend the way that you do, even if they would consider themselves best friends with that person as well, they won't know everything, because how the two of you transact your relationship verbally and non-verbally. Non-verbal, that's in next week. Anyway, but how you transact your relationship through your communication, through your verbal communication, is different than what other people may. So that's and one other thing is that the truth of it is that relationships, they actually presume that there's going to be a common shared knowledge. That if you're withholding, someone says, "What's wrong with you?" and they're a good friend, you say, "What's wrong?" You go, "Nothing." You go, "Wait a minute, you can't tell me nothing. What's wrong?" Well, when we start going through what are we doing? We're trying to open up to gain shared knowledge. And all relationships, for the most part, that's how they work, especially the close personal ones. So that takes us to a place called the conversational hypertext. Now, we all know what a hypertext is. We see it on a or a hyperlink. We understand it a little bit that way. But what is a conversational hypertext? Well, those are coded messages that are in a conversation that you have with that only an informed listener will understand easily. When you're growing up, and if you grew up with siblings, there were things that you and your siblings probably could talk about without really talking about it openly, but everybody knew what was going on. Your friends, you may have a friend that's like that. Well, conversational hypertext, that's what that's referred to. When people use a word that suggests more about a topic, which on a computer, if you were talking about a hyperlink, that there's something in the text. It's maybe it's highlighted, but when you click on it, it takes you someplace else. Well, in a conversation, when you're having it with your friends, and you might even you might use an old memory. Remember, at least he's not as bad as so and so was, and if maybe it's just the two of you that know about that particular person. And the other person goes, "Oh, yeah, no kidding. That's the truth." Now, anybody else would have no clue, but it's because you used a conversational hypertext. Think about it. Note how many times that happens when you're talking with your friends, and you make comments that take the thought process someplace else, simply because you share that with them. So that's conversational language, is used a lot, and it seems natural in a personal relationship. It actually does. And when we encounter somebody who doesn't know the code, we recognize the hypertext, and we realize it needs to be unpacked or expanded or somehow to address directly to them. And you'll see that happen in conversations when someone will make a comment about, you have someone in the circle. Let's say there's three of you, and two of you know about this individual. And the comments may, "Well, at least he's not like so and so," and you see the look on this other person's face, and so you turn to them, and now you're going to decode the hypertext by telling us that, "Well, you understand, this guy was this, and he did this, or she did that, and this is kind of the personality they were really this, or they were really that." Anyway, and you're trying to bring them into the conversation. So you're unpacking it or expanding it, but you're doing it directly to them. That's how we handle the conversational hypertext in a normal conversation. Now, verbal communication, is also not only just relational, but it's very cultural. It is as cultural, in fact, as it is relational. You see, verbal communication influences culture, and culture, in fact, influences communication. Now, there are, the dimensions of culture would include groups of people who share distinct meanings and style of speaking. And in those things, the values and beliefs of those cultures are embedded in the meanings. So a multiple cultural group exists within larger nation states, and certainly in ours. If you were talking about, well, what culture do you come from? or what's your culture? Well, how many can you think? All right, you can say, well, I am an American. I am a Midwestern American. I am a Hoosier. I am I am a native of Northern Indiana. I am not only that. Let's go another direction. I am male. I am married. I have been divorced. I am a parent. I am a brother. I am a son. I am white. I am middle-aged. Give me that, please. I'm middle-aged. I am a Methodist. I am I'm also. Where else can you go? I mean, there's so many different places and different things and groups and stuff that I am. I am an instructor at IPFW. I am an instructor at Ivy Tech. Your subcultures are when you start looking at them, there's a lot of those things there, and so there's a lot of cultures that are around us, and you belong to many of them. Now, verbal communication, in fact, transacts culture. It helps us to kind of talk back, and when we talk back and forth, we understand things. The verbal communication and other symbolic activity that cultures are developed and maintained, and cultures are symbolic creations. In fact, when the movie The Sandlot, if you're familiar with that, a young boy moves into a neighborhood where there's a bunch of ball players, young guys, and he barely knows much about baseball at all. Wasn't really raised in that culture, and so they begin to enculturate him. They begin to pull him in. They start defining some things that he needs to understand. If you're going to be a part of the Sandlot ball team, there's some things you have to know. You have to know how to throw. You have to know how to hit. You have to know how to catch. True. But you got to know the right clothes to wear. You got to know the jargon. You got to know the historical stuff. So he learns about Babe Ruth. He learns about the traditions of the Sandlot. He learns about the Beast, and all of the trappings that go along with that. What are they doing? They're helping him to understand how their culture works, and they're transacting it by telling him, this is what you do. Hey, here, wear this cap. Hey, here's a baseball mitt for you. Quit wearing those kind of shirts. Get a T-shirt on. We don't wear button down, whatever. But you can see it does. The culture is transacted. If you understand transaction, meaning that you give, and then there's a return then of information, in which you then adapt that information, and the culture is developed. And that's because cultures are symbolic creations. In fact, cultural groups are distinct and they're brought into being because of the way that their members communicate, how they talk to one another. That's how they understand the culture and how it develops. And so through our relationships, we come to understand cultural ways of communicating. So, and those are learned through interactions with family, friends, neighbors, classmates, coworkers, and other people. That's part of it. So culture doesn't just happen because it already exists. In fact, we do culture. We talk certain ways in certain situations because that's what's expected. We're aware of stories, and we tell those stories in certain situations because we know that's what's expected. It's transaction. Okay, well, there's enough about that. But cultures also, then they regulate communication. Cultures influence the meanings that are given to words and the words that are used. When you talk about, just think about any kind of culture here on campus, the different cultures that there are. There are certain words that mean different things in different cultures or in different groups of people. And when you're with a particular culture, you're going to communicate in a unique way most of the time with those members. Now, it may not be totally unique. In fact, there may be some things that sound, somebody else from a different type culture could totally, completely understand. But truthfully, when you think about it, there are words and things that we use and stories we tell and things we understand that work in certain cultures. And when we are in those cultures or with those people, we do them. And so understand the reason this is because of the meanings or the meaning systems and norms of those groups. So cultures are created through verbal communication. And when we say or don't say something, that in fact reinforces those cultures. So talking is important. So what are the cultural ways of, what is that cultural ways of talking? Well, those are styles of cultural talk that are usually applied, to nation states. The characteristic, is really broad. For instance, ways of talking, feminine versus masculine, or high context versus low context, or the collectivist versus the individualist. All of those things, they make a difference in how the language is used and ways that things are talked about, because in those cultures it affects how we think of topics in general, and we begin to talk that direction. So it's kind of interesting. Well, not only is it just the cultural ways of talking, but now verbal communication and frames. Now, frames are just areas of understanding. They are realms that we create through relationships, and sometimes even in locations and cultures. But the truth of it is that when you are talking to another student in their language, you are assuming that when you're talking about school, that you're talking about IPFW, you're talking about academia, or in an education setting, because you're talking to another student. Right? And that helps us to know how we should communicate, because you can use certain words in an academic setting, or in a work setting, or in a if you're at a football game, all of the things that are talked about in all those three different areas. I mean, they are understood that that's where you're at, and that's how words should be defined. And so these frames help us to communicate in certain settings. We choose meanings that fit into the framework that we have. And when we're talking in a particular frame, in other words, if we're at a football game and we talk about, boy, you really hit him, didn't he? We're not talking about someone that just punched somebody, at least hopefully not. We're talking about a tackle, and we understand that. At least most people do. And so they'll respond, the way that we think. So, yeah, I thought he was going to get away, but boy, he sure did hit him right at the knees, or whatever it is. And there are things when we're on a football field, or when we're at a football game, there are certain symbols and things that, motions that are made by the referees, by the team as they're communicating. Anyway, when we look at these things, we understand that those symbols, that they have meaning of some sort. And if you're around a football game a lot, then you begin to understand what the referees symbols that they choose to use with their hands. That in fact, this what it means, whether it's offsides or touchdown or whatever it might be. But frames are important, and sometimes, like I say, it's not just in how relationships or cultures, but actually physical location that is a part of that. So now let's go to if you're talking to somebody at the mall, and say you're going to run over to the store, to a store, they probably aren't going to assume you're going to go to the grocery store, because you're in a mall. You're not at they don't have grocery stores in malls, usually not anyway. Not only the frames are assumed, but sometimes you have to signal them. Frames, different frames can be used. It's not just one. Sometimes you can use a multiple frame, and you follow that. You lead the person there in the way that you communicate what you're trying to say, and you can change it and say, yeah, tomorrow I'm going to go to some place, and I'm going to go get and whatever you do. They are following you. They're reframing the conversation to say you're talking about something that you're going to do tomorrow, and you're going to be someplace else. And so whatever you're saying, they understand that. So different frames can be very, very helpful. And if you're trying to, when you're recognizing those frames, the thing of it is that a number of types of conversational frames can be applied when you're interacting with others. There's because of the way that we talk with one another, we don't stay in we don't talk about just one thing. Generally, our conversations can take us in different places, in different, into different frameworks, because that's where the conversation's going. And so when our ability to follow that helps us to understand, and when we don't follow it, causes confusion. And if you've ever been talking with somebody and suddenly you realize that they're talking about a totally different thing that you were thinking of, and all of a sudden it does, and you notice because it doesn't make sense, well, you just realize that they're using a different frame, and you may have to ask them, what are we talking about? And then they'll tell you, and then and you're back. That's a change in frame that they didn't let you know was coming. But relationships and cultures influence how verbal communication is used and what it means, and our understanding of relationships and cultures enables us to use them as frames when assigning meaning to the verbal communication that we're having. So it helps us to we can use those cultural things and the understanding of relationships to frame things, so that in certain situations some things are okay and acceptable, and other things they're not. And it could depend, in fact, on the relationships, the cultures, and the physical location, which can certainly be a factor. Okay, moving on. Let's go to ways of speaking. Now we're talking about, remember, verbal communication. So what are these ways? They were mentioned a little bit ago, but we're going briefly, but here's some things you need to know. Now, the form of language is selected to express thoughts and emotions carries some important relational messages. The form of language that we use also enables people to properly frame and interact. And there are a couple of them. There's formal and informal. High code is a more formal it's more grammatical and correct. So it is a higher way of speaking. It's more formal in its content. Low code is informal and often is ungrammatical. In other words, it can be just kind of free flying. And when you listen to people talk and they're talking over one another, you got a lot of low code stuff going on. It's okay, either one works, but it depends on the relationship and this individual, whether or not they can follow you through. So you got to kind of keep an eye on that and see how that works out. So when you're speaking and someone that you're talking to is unfamiliar or they're with greater power or higher social rank, you tend to use high code. For instance, in class, you may be more likely to refer to me as Professor so-and-so, what is my last name? Oh, yes, Professor Neville, which is okay. But I'm just saying, but it's not demanded by me, as I told you. I'd just as soon be called Roy. It's fine with me. But when people don't know you very well in the beginning of relationships, they will, and if they believe that there is a reason to think highly of you, either because of your office, or maybe it could be your age, it could be your presence, just how they how when they look at you, or it's just how they feel that they need to address you. They're going to use a high code talk, which is more formal. And sometimes that happens when a person is uncomfortable. For instance, when you have to say the words, "Why, yes, officer. How can I help you today?" That's probably not how you talk to your friends, right? Yes, Judge, Your Honor, Your Highness, you're in control. Whatever. When situation like that, oh yeah, that calls for some high code stuff. All right. So now, one of the things about going back to talking about this, how we handle these the relational frames, they can be adjusted during an interaction. You can start out and frame a situation where you're using more high code talk until you realize it's unnecessary, and then you relax and you begin to kind of go back in your words, and your nonverbals change, and because your feelings are changing about the situation. When the policeman comes up to you and you say, "Yes, officer, how can I help you? What was it?" And they look at you and say, "Oh, nothing. I just, you're driving so well. I just wanted to stop and just stop and tell you how much we appreciate your good driving habits." Now, maybe that's never happened to you. I don't know, but if it did, you would totally relax, and suddenly you're like, "Well, thanks a lot for that," and you would go from high code to low code or somewhere in the middle, maybe, but it would change, and that happens in conversations that we have. We change the words and the nonverbal communication to indicate that there's a relational connection with the person with whom we're interacting, and they refer to that as accommodation. Now, there's also two other words. Let's get through those: convergence and divergence. All right. Convergence, if you know your prefixes, con usually means to be with, and so if convergence means that you move toward the style of talk that's used by the other speaker, and that's always interesting. I have a close friend who is Hispanic, and I don't talk to him very often. I mean, like once every 15 years, but I know that when I do, all of a sudden I have what I determine to be a Hispanic accent. I have no idea why I do that, except that I do, and I experience convergence. If I'm talking to somebody from the South, I'll pick up my old Kentucky accent, and as soon as I do that, I start talking. Well, you see what I say. I talk like this. I use y'all a lot, and I'm like, going down in the holler to go down and do some fishing, and so hope we can catch us some crappie and some bass. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Anyway, that's convergence, okay? And it's funny when you hear it, and it's even more funny when you do it. There's the other style is divergence. Now that's when you go and you move away from that style to make a relational point that maybe you change so that you would appear to be more superior, or the fact is that you're suddenly uncomfortable, and so you change how you talk. That would be divergence. And those things, sometimes we find that happen. You'll find that happening. It's very interesting when it does. Okay, so let's get to it. Verbal communication is presentational. Now, it can be representational in that we name things and we convey information, and it can also be presentational in that we provide information about the perspective or worldview of the person sending a message. That's what it does. It presents and tells us, or we project how the type of individual that we are when we speak, and that's it's just a way that it works. The choice of words that we use when we're describing a scene or persuading someone, discussing another person, or talking about the weather is meaningful and conveys our worldview to others. But all communication is presentational. Yep. When we're talking, we are presenting something, even if it's just our opinion. But we are presenting something, because we're trying to get some information to someone or persuade them, whatever. When we tell stories and we provide accounts, the presentational nature is really recognizable. So if you're trying to recount back to a police officer what you saw of an accident, what you do is very presentational, which makes sense. And we tell stories. We tell stories, we tell stories all the time. At least I know a lot of people do. Maybe you don't, but many people do. Telling stories occurs in everyday life. Stories about ourselves or others. Sometimes it's funny stories. We like to talk about who we are. We want people. We want to tell them this stuff. And you see that competition happen in conversations when someone brings up one thing and then they're going to do a one-up on them. They're going to go one more better. Well, that's us. That's who we are. Especially as Americans and Western culture. Oh yeah. We want to tell because we want to matter as individuals. We want to matter. And so we tell stories. It is an overwhelmingly human and important tendency. Now, not only we tell stories, but there are also narratives. Uh, there are also narratives that, which is an organized story, or it's a report, or it could be a prepared talk. But a narrative has a plot, an argument, or a theme, or can be interpreted, at least understood, to have one. What is involved when we say what people are doing, why they're doing it, and why they're doing what they're doing? Those are narratives, and those narratives can include funny things, tragic events, significant emotional experiences, relational stories. Describing one's day is a narrative. Where you're telling the whole deal. Well, you're going to believe what happened to me today, and you start in with your story. It is told as a narrative. You're narrating the thing. Narratives are presentational because speakers arrange the story in a way to provide their perspective. They're not just relating facts. And when you use this in public speaking, that's the heart of a great public presentation. Especially in the stuff that we do in our classes, is to be able to talk about something that's related to you. And I've told you that over and over again, even in the short period of time that we've been together, but that's an important aspect you need to be aware of. And usually those stories are often slanted in our favor. And if they're not slanted in our favor, then we're telling them because they're funny, and we want people to laugh, and we want to have them feel good about us, because we told a funny story. And there's a lot of days you'll hear things in class that I tell that I think are funny, and if you laugh, I guess they are. So anyway, so it works. Okay. So yeah, but not only it's telling stories and narratives, but sometimes it's giving an account. When you give an account, it's a form of communication that offers things like justification, or it could be excuses. I'm telling you, I had no idea. I didn't see it happening. I don't know what. Okay. Excuses, exonerations, explanations, accusations, and even apologies. I am so sorry. I had no idea. Okay. Well, you get it. So those are what they refer to as giving an account, and an account goes way beyond the fact. It's very emotional. There's stories that justify, or they blame someone, or they call for someone to account for what happened. And these reported facts are presentational. Some people say, well, they spin a little bit, and isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth? Well, I didn't know it because I wasn't actually looking in that particular direction, so that's why I didn't see it. But you did look. Well, yes, but I didn't see it. That's spin, and that's a part of giving an account. Relationships affect whether accounts are given and how they're structured, and oftentimes how well they're believed. But we don't talk about that, okay? Okay, so just as a kind of a quick review about the functions of verbal communication. Using verbal communication and all symbolic activity is transacted. There's give and take there. Things are accomplished beyond the exchange of symbols. The verbal communication enables people to symbolically represent objects, ideas, places, and so on. And verbal communication also presents the worldviews of others through created meanings, realities, relationships, identities, and cultures. The stuff of life is created, transformed, and maintained through verbal communication and other symbolic activity. It's how it works. And influencing others, when we talk about face work and politeness, people generally want to be viewed as favorable to others. I think that's very true, don't you? You want to be thought of as favorable. You want them to have positive feelings about you. And so because of that, they want to also, and they want to be accepted and be viewed with respect. And then there's other times when people will need to impact the behaviors of others, which could be minor or major if you're trying to have some kind of an influence. And this influencing involves face work and politeness. So what is face work? Face work is refers to the management. Face work refers to the management of people's faces, dignity, respect, and acceptance. Now we don't do that a lot in the American culture, but at any rate, People want to, well, there are face wants, for instance, that can be positive or negative. Positive face wants are dealt with and satisfied verbal communication. Negative face wants refer to the desire not to be imposed on or treated as inferior. So, and then as opposed to that, you have face concerns. Face concerns are evident among those sharing a relationship. Use of either type of face allows us to manage our relationships by paying attention to the ways and people need to be seen in the social world. And relationship management is done in talk. So maintaining positive face. Face is something managed by people in social interactions, and we cooperate to maintain positive face for ourselves and others. We avoid negative face for ourselves and others. No one wants to embarrass somebody else unless you're trying to be funny. No one likes to be embarrassed in public unless you have some kind of a bend in your personality or something. We always want, no one wants to, if someone, if you're in a restaurant and a child that you're with dumps water and it falls in your lap, it's really difficult to get up and walk through a restaurant when there are people who didn't see that child dump that water, and you got to walk through with this dark spot in the crotch of your pants, and you know what people are thinking. What do you do? Cover it and walk, I suppose. But that really bothers us. Well, there was nothing that happened. A child dumped water and it hit you, but you know what they're thinking, and the embarrassment is what you would refer to as a negative face. And no one likes that sort of thing. In verbal communication, there is something called the politeness theory. In our interactions with other people, in our verbal communications with other people, we have, there is an opportunity, well, not opportunity, but there is the occasion when we, in fact, could diminish the positive face of another person, that we could embarrass them, that we could say something publicly that we should have kept private. But in the heat of the moment or the thoughtlessness of the moment, we say something that we shouldn't have. That is, and we could even impose a negative face on somebody, not just diminish the positive face, but do real serious damage to them. And the truth of it is that that face threatening situations, they're not at all equal, not a bit. When you're trying to, should I say something or shouldn't I say something? You know that it could have a negative impact. The things that you have to consider are, for instance, the relationship that's shared between you and the other people, and the power difference. If you have power over somebody because it's an employee that you are, or a someone that you manage, or it's anything like that, or even and not only those things, but also just how big is the imposition you're about to place on them. You can determine whether or not it's something, but you have to think about it. That's the hard part. Some relationships are more likely to make impositions even appropriate. There are some people that we are so close to that no matter what we say, everyone, quote, laughs it off, and truly does. Differences in power can even make those impositions a little bit more appropriate. There's just different things you need to consider. So, is there a strategy to make it happen? Yes, there is. Here they are. One is to act directly without the concern for face names. Just do it. Then there's the one where when you're talking about somebody, you're trying to be positive, you're trying to build them up, you want to focus on the positive face. You can acknowledge the possibility of negative face and draw attention a little bit to something that may be a problem, which is negative politeness. Then there's off the record where you act in a very vague manner. You're not saying it too straight. And then there's avoidance. This is how you just totally avoid it because it's too big of a deal to even consider. So you want to just let it go. Politeness in verbal communication is very important. Hurt feelings are never good. Broken relationships are awful, and those relationships that are terminated forever are a terrible loss, especially when it comes down to the fact that it was just because of something that we said. I hope this gave you some insight and that you will get the quiz taken and be ready for class next week when we talk about nonverbal communication.